Hi everyone, it's Sherry Vegas here, and in this resin tutorial today I'm going to be doing a complete beginner's guide to casting resin. So if you're brand new into resin and you want to learn about how you can use resin to cast items like coasters, keychains, a whole bunch of different things that involve molds and resins, then this is the video for you. I'm going to be going over all of the basics that you need to know before you kind of get started and breaking it down and making it a bit more simple, because it is quite overwhelming when you're first getting into resin to know which resins to use, how to use them, what molds, what can you add in, what can you not add in, how to create certain effects. So I'm going to be covering all of those basics in this video. And I also can't believe it has taken me this long to do a beginner's guide for casting. I have got multiple beginner's guides up for all different things, but it has taken me quite a while to get into beginner's guide for casting. So let's get into it. And the first thing that we're going to be talking about is the resin, which is one of the most important things when you are casting resin. Now I'm going to be doing a little bit of talking at the start, just breaking it down, explaining it, and then I'm going to be going into some tutorials and showing you how to create different effects using different techniques at the end of this video. So feel free, I'll add the timings down below and you can jump sections if you already know some of those things. So first up, we are talking about resin, and there's a little bit to go over, and having a better understanding of resin is really going to impact the way that your items turn out. Now for this video, I am focusing on shallow pour casting items. If you do want a beginner's guide to deep pouring, then let me know down in the comments below and I'll do a beginner's guide to that, because it's completely different techniques and completely different amount of knowledge, and this video would be very, very long if I covered everything. So for this one, we're focusing on shallow casting, and we're focusing on epoxy resin. So first up, you're gonna look around and there's a whole bunch of different brands, and this will just depend on which part of the world you are in for what kind of resins that you can get. So when you are looking at casting resins, they generally are always, epoxy casting resins come in a two-part system. So one part is resin, one part is hardener, and when you mix those together, it creates that chemical reaction that causes that resin to then set. You'll also notice a lot of your casting resins come in two different size bottles. So majority of epoxy casting resins will not be a 1-to-1 ratio. They're generally a 2-to-1 or even a 2.5 or a 3-to-1. You'll rarely find a casting resin that is a 1-to-1 ratio. So you can see here there's a big size difference, but this is from the same packet, which means that as long as I measure out my resin correctly, I'll use both of these bottles up at the same time, because this one is a 2-to-1. The reason behind that most manufacturers will make casting resins a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 is just because, unlike an art resin that we'd be putting on a surface, so like to do a serving board or to do an artwork, where we want that resin to be thicker, we want it to grip to the surface so that way it doesn't just flow off. With casting resins, we want the opposite, because we're pouring them into molds, so we don't have any issue of them just flowing off if they're too fluid. But we want them to be able to move in those molds, fill out those areas, as well as release bubbles, because we don't want to have a resin that is too bubbly. So it's very vital when you are starting out that you do get a casting resin and not an art resin. Now, if you are in a different part of the world and you cannot get the brands that I talk about, there's a few things that you can look at that are going to help you decide on which resin to get. And they will generally always say on the box, or they will have a data sheet that you can download if it is a reputable resin company, and that way that's going to help you. But a few things that you need to look for is, first of all, it will say casting. If it is an epoxy resin, it will always say epoxy casting, and that is vital, as I just explained before. This one says it's an easy to use 2-to-1 ratio, so therefore I've already got my measurements. Different brands can have different ratios, so do not just assume all casting resins are a 2-to-1, and always check whether they want you to measure out by volume or by weight. And that is very important to just double check that. Most casting resins are done by volume, so a mixing jug and just doing it in mils. but not all are. This one also says it's a crystal clear, it's a 2-to-1 mix, it's an artist casting, self-leveling, and it's tintable, which means you can add color into this if you wanted to. Those are all really important things to look for. And another important thing to look for when you are looking for resin is its working time and its curing time and its hardening time. So if you've never worked with resin before, and this goes across all resins, you've got different timings and different life stages of that resin. So when you first mix up your resin, it's going to be at its most fluid, it's going to move because it's freshly mixed. And as it gets down to that working time, and this is what we call a pot life, which is the amount of time you can keep it in the pot and work with it before it does start to cure, that can change depending on the resin. This one has 40 minutes, this one has got like a longer 2-hour working time or 90-minute working time, and then from there you've got your curing time. So some can have, super fast setting resins can have a 3-hour curing time, some can have 12 hours, 48 hours, and those are just important things to look at, and that will depend on the projects that you're doing. But generally, when it has a really long working time, it means that it has it's a more fluid viscosity resin, which then allows me to do other techniques. And when I learnt that not all casting resins were the same, you can pick different types of casting resins for different techniques you want to create, that completely changed how I made pieces, understanding that. I do find in general that your thicker casting resins do hold pigment generally better, but they do get a bit more bubbles. They're not ideal for doing like crystal clear castings. So if you wanted to, put a flower or put something in and just do a clear casting, they are harder to work with on that. You can still use them, definitely, but you just have to sort of combat that sort of bubbles that you might get when you are doing clear castings, because you will really notice them. With a casting resin that has a longer working time and is more fluid, they are generally better at doing clear castings because of that working time being so long. It allows those bubbles that you might have in the resin to come up to the surface. So that really helps giving that longer time. But on a resin that's got a shorter working time, all those bubbles don't have time to come up to the surface, which then cause them getting trapped as the resin starts to harden. Now, another factor that comes into play is how deep do you want your piece to be? Are you doing a shallow casting, or are you doing a deep piece that is quite thick? Now, the two resins that I've just shown you are both shallow casting resins, and this is a really important thing to look at when you are choosing your resin, is how deep is it recommended to pour at each time. So for these, I think both of them are either 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters in depth maximum. Different resins can have different depths, and the reason behind this is if you pour over this, if you do a really big pour, you mix up a bunch of resin and you pour it all at once and you've got it about 4 centimeters, 5 centimeters, you've gone way over the recommended guideline, you're going to end up with issues with your resin. And a few things can happen. The deeper your resin is with shallow casting, the hotter it gets, and that's called exotherm. And what happens when that happens is a few things. One, your resin will get so hot, it will damage your molds. It will also get so hot that you'll end up getting massive big air bubbles all through your pieces. You can also end up having your resin yellow a lot faster because the heat is making your resin exotherm, which then is causing yellowing. So you might have beautiful crystal clear resin, you've poured it really deep, you come back and it's gone really yellow because you've gone over that guideline. So it is vital that if you are working with shallow casting resins, you pour at the recommended guidelines. You do not go over that because you can run into so many issues. And that is also another reason why we don't use art resins in casting, because art resins are designed to be just poured on the surface. They're not designed to be poured deep because you can only pour so much on a surface before it starts to pour off. So if you've ever used an art resin and put it into a mold, you'll find that it will probably exotherm because it's not meant to be deep at all. So if you do want to do a piece that is quite deep, I would recommend then switching over to a deep pour resin that is designed to do that. So deep pours are normally designed to go, I think, for like 4 centimeters and above, and they are designed not to exotherm. They're designed to be poured at that really deep level. But if you are working with shallow casting and you still want to do quite a big piece, you just need to pour in layers. So you want to pour your resin, do all the same things, mix your resin up, pour it down, but you need to let that resin set and cool down before you pour the next layer. So you can definitely still work with shallow castings and do deep pieces. You just have to do it in layers and let the first layers cool down and set. So what can you add into resin? Because I've talked a lot about adding items into resin and doing clear castings. And basically you can add any items as long as they're dry. So as long as they don't contain moisture. So if you want to put flowers in, you cannot add fresh flowers in. If you add fresh flowers into resin, they will look good for like maybe a few days, a week, look really amazing, but the moisture gets trapped inside the resin and has nowhere to go, so it starts to rot the flowers and you'll end up with just black flowers in your resin and it looks terrible. So any item you add in needs to be a dry item. It cannot have moisture because it will get trapped in there. And now that brings me on to the next part of information that you need to know, which is bubbles. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information, a lot of technical stuff straight at you, but this is really important to learn if you want to have pieces that are really successful every single time. So we get bubbles from when we mix our resin. Now there are a lot of things you can do that will help prevent bubbles and a lot of things you can do that will help get rid of bubbles. So when we are mixing up our resin, we have to make sure we mix our resin up correctly. If we don't mix our resin correctly, we can have a piece that doesn't fully cure or fully set because both part A and B need to properly combine for the resin to cure properly. And if you don't do that, you can have parts that will be like hard and some parts that will be soft or floppy resin, or it might just forever remain sticky. So when we do mix our resin up, you are going to get bubbles. It's just a part of the game. But there are things you can do. So when I do mix resin, I mix very, very slowly. The more you whisk and whip your resin up, the more bubbles you're going to add in. You don't want to have any sort of what we call ribbons where you can see them sort of streaking through the resin. You want your resin to go back to being crystal clear once the resin and the hardener is set. If it's still foggy or if it's still got those like tiny bits of separation, the ribbons where the resin and the hardener haven't mixed, you need to keep mixing. And it's incredibly important that you mix. Another thing that you can also do is let your resin sit for a little bit. So by letting your resin sit for a little bit before you start working with it, it gives those bubbles a chance to come up to the surface, and then you can either use your heat gun or a blowtorch or just let them pop naturally once they are up to the surface before you then put them in a mold. And the reason why it's good to just leave it in your jug instead of pouring it into the mold and letting those bubbles come up into the mold, your jug has no sort of places where the bubbles can get trapped, so it's a lot easier for them to float straight up. But if you don't wait and you pour straight into your mold, depending on your mold, if it's got curves or got like sort of corners or funny sort of shapes into it, the bubbles can get trapped into those. It is good to just let them sit for a bit and you'll find so many bubbles will come up to the surface and you can use your heat gun to pop them. And along the lines of heat pops bubbles really well in resin, but it can only penetrate down so deep. So if you do have a good amount of resin that you have mixed up and you use your heat gun, it's only going to get the surface where those bubbles are. It will not penetrate the whole way down. And that is an issue that a lot of people, when they do casting items, because we are pouring into molds and they are going down lengthwise and not out like you would with an art resin because you're pouring over a surface, is getting those bubbles out using heat. So you can use a blowtorch, a heat gun. They're both really helpful items, but they will only get the surface. So if you've got a ton of bubbles in your mixture and you pour it straight in, you're only going to be able to get the bubbles that are on the surface off. So it's really good to just give that a little bit of time to sit there, rest, let them all come up get rid of them, and then pour. Now, if you're worried about using heat, you can always do the alcohol spray technique. Once again, this can only get to the surface layer, so it can only do the bubbles that are on top. And how this works is alcohol, when you spray it across the surface, it breaks that surface tension, which then allows those bubbles to come up that are just underneath the surface and pop. Alcohol will evaporate, so it should not affect your resin as long as you only use a small amount. So now that we have a good understanding of what resins to go for, what to look for, and how the resins work, let's move on to a little bit of safety. If you've never done any work with resin, you always need to wear gloves. You definitely do not want to get any resin on your skin. A respirator, especially if you have any breathing issues. Now, a lot of manufacturers do now say that you don't have to have a respirator on if it doesn't contain any VOCs, but it's honestly personal preference. When I've been working with resin for many years, and I work for many hours per day. I like to put a respirator on because I am just getting a lot of exposure to the resin, even if it doesn't have VOCs. And also too, when you do add heat to your resin, it can sometimes release some fumes. So let's move on to adding color into your resin. So I like to use pigments that are designed for resin just because I know that they're going to work really well in the resin, and they're going to work every single time. And they are also made to be super strong, which is really helpful because we want colors that are very pigmented, very strong, so that way we can use less in our resin and it doesn't affect the way that the resin sets. Now, most resins you can only add about 5 to 10% absolute maximum of color into your resin. If you add more than that, it can cause issues with your resin setting. Because your resin is a 2-to-1 ratio, say it is, if you add more of a third element in, that throws off that ratio and can affect how your resin sets. So it is really important that you stick to that 5 to 10% maximum for the amount of resin that you are using. So if you're making a really big piece, you're obviously going to add more color in because you're going to be using more resin. I do also sometimes work with alcohol inks in my resin, and they do work well most of the time, but obviously the majority of your alcohol inks are translucent, so if you don't want a translucent piece, you're not going to necessarily want to always just use alcohol inks, but you can get away with alcohol inks in your resin. So you'll generally find either resin pigments coming in powder version, in a liquid version, or in a cream version. I've talked a lot about the pouring of the resin, but I haven't talked about what you pour the resin into, and that is a silicone molds. Now, there are other items that you can use to pour resin into, but for this we're going to cover silicone molds. The reason why we like to use silicone molds as a resin artist is, one, they're very flexible, so it's easy to pop the hardened resin piece out of, and two, the resin doesn't stick to silicone because it's nice and shiny and doesn't have the ability to grip and glue itself too. So that is why we use silicone molds. When you're looking for a silicone mold, I've got one that's pink silicone, one that's clear. You can see that this one has a shine to it. Whatever texture is in here, your resin's going to mold to that, and you're going to get that same effect. So this has got a nice shine to it, which means I am then going to get a shiny resin piece. But with this mold that I have here, it has a matte finish to it. It's got no shine to it, so therefore whatever piece I make from that is going to have a matte finish to it, because your resin will pick up the finish of the mold. Something else that comes into play when you're trying to create different resin effects in your casting pieces is the depth of your mold. If your mold is more deep, then you can find that you'll get some really bigger patterns happening and some really cool effects because you've got more resin and it has more ability to flow through. If your mold is more shallow, sometimes those patterns can be a lot more smaller because there's less resin and less ability of it to flow through and create those patterns. So the depth of your mold can make a really big difference in getting some really cool effects. You can see here I've got two coasters, the exact same technique, tricks, all of that was used. The only difference is one was a deep mold, one was a shallow one, and I got two different sort of patterns happening. So for these coasters, I'm going to be using a cream pigment, that's a titanium white, which is quite a heavy and dense pigment. Then I'm going to be using a powder pigment, which is Opal, and it is from Art Tree Creation, and that is a buildable pigment, so I'm only going to be adding a little bit in, so it's going to be sitting around that medium range. And then I'm going to be using a tint. Tints are going to always be the lightest out of all of your different types of resin pigments, and so because they are the lightest, it means that they are less dense and they are going to float over a pigment that is a titanium white or a cream pigment that's a lot more dense, that is going to sink. When your resin has no color in it, it always the same because it's just the resin. So if you divided up your resin into 3 different cups, as long as you've got the same amount in each cup, it's all going to weigh the same. As soon as you start adding colors and other items into your resin, it then changes the weight and the density of that resin. And because I am using a cream, a powder, and a tint, they all have a different weight to them. So when I do add them into my resin, even though I've got the same amounts of all 3, I'm going to be changing that resin, changing the weight and the density. You'll find that most of your cream pigments will generally be a lot denser than a powder or a tint. So if I pour my white down first into my coaster and then pour my tint and my powder down, because those are both lighter than my white, they don't have the ability to push that white up off the bottom, and therefore the white is just going to stay on the bottom of my mold. But if I put my tint and my powder down first, because they are lighter, and then I pour my heaviest pigment at the end, it then has the ability to push down through the tint and the powder colored pigment, powder colored resin, and therefore it can create some really cool effects. So a titanium cream pigment white is going to be very dense, very heavy, so you can switch that out off to an alcohol ink or even to like a casting craft, a translucent white, and also add less white into your resin, make it more translucent than opaque, and that means you can then put it down first, and when you do put other colors that are at the same density, it will still be able to push it away. So as long as whatever you put down first is lighter, it has the ability to be pushed away by whatever you add on top. And that is how this effect is created, which is called the Larimer effect. So I do have a full tutorial on this. I've got 2 that I will link up in this video, which you can look at. On this next tutorial, I'm going to be covering adding items into your resin and doing a clear casting. On this first one, I'm just going to be placing my flowers down and then just pouring my full amount of resin over the top. And what you can see here is because the flowers are lighter than the resin, so they're not as dense as the resin, they're going to naturally float to the top and end up poking out of the top of my resin piece, which is what I don't want. They're also going to move around and change my design. So what we need to do to combat that is pour in layers. So on this next piece, I'm going to pour some resin down just to coat the bottom of my coaster, and then I'm going to place my flowers on top. I'm then going to let that fully dry before I then do my next layer. This next layer will then seal my flowers exactly where I want them. They're not going to have the ability to move because they're already stuck in the first layer, and they're not going to have the ability to float up and pop out of the top of my resin. So if you ever are casting any items, you do need to do one layer to help set them into place, and then do your next layers to cover them up. If you just try to do one big pour, you're going to find that they're just going to all float up to the top if they're not denser than the resin you're pouring on top. And the last thing that I'm going to cover that can really affect the way that your items will turn out when you are doing shallow casting is the timing. If you want to do a particular effect, sometimes it does come down to the timing. So when you first mix up your resin, it's going to be at its most fluid point and it's going to flow and move and have the ability to change quite a lot. As that resin starts to get closer to the ending of its pot life where it starts to gel and set, it's going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. And as it gets thicker, it will have less ability to move. And sometimes that can be really helpful when you're creating particular effects, because if your resin is too fluid, it will blend too much and you might lose the effect that you're trying to create. And this in particular happens when you're doing any sort of resin 3D flower bloom technique. Now, if you do this, and especially if you're working with a really fluid resin, you're going to find that as you add your petals down on top of your clear resin, it has too much ability to move if you do this within the first part of that sort of stage of your pot life, because it's going to be too fluid and expand out too much. But if you wait for that resin to start to get thicker, get more closer to the end of its pot life, so it's starting to set, it's getting a bit thicker, and you add down your petals to create that 3D bloom effect, they're not going to have the ability to flow as much and therefore hold that shape in the resin. Now, whenever I do create a 3D bloom effect, I try not to go by timing but by temperature, because as we've talked about previously, as the resin does start to set, it will get a bit warmer, and so therefore the temperature is going to go up, and that is an indicator to me about when I can then add my petals in on top of my clear resin to create that bloom effect. So normally I like around 39 to 40 degrees is the perfect time that I find I can add my petals in, my colored resin in, pipe that in, pour that in, however you want to do it, to get the perfect 3D resin bloom effect. Now, if you do want to learn more about how to create the 3D bloom effects, I do have a few videos that are a lot more in-depth. I just don't want to overload everyone that's watching this or make this video even longer than what it already is. So definitely go and check those out. I will link them up above. So this is the absolutely last thing that we're going to be covering, and thank you so much if you've made it this far. Give this video a big thumbs up if it's been helpful, and don't forget to check out the other videos. But anyway, the last thing that we're covering is how to finish the pieces. Once you've got them out of the mold, how do you finish them? Now, if you pulled out a piece and you're pretty happy with it, it's pretty perfect, then that's fine. I would just go along, check the edges, because sometimes you can get really sharp edges where the mold and the resin has met. And you can always just use a deburring tool or a Stanley knife and take those sharp edges off, or a little bit of sandpaper, and just make sure that there's no issues with that. But you don't have to go through and polish it or sand it or top coat it. You only need to do those things if you've got a piece that you need to fix in some way. Now, if you pulled out an item and there was maybe a bubble on the surface and now you've got a little divot, or it just hasn't come out perfect and it's not looking great, or the mold was matte and you want it to be shiny, you can always do a top coat. So a top coat is where you use a top coating resin, which is normally a 1:1 ratio because it's going to be poured over the top. You want to either tape off the bottom of your piece just so that way you're not going to get any resin drips, or you can use latex or masking tape. It's completely up to you, but you want to protect the bottom of your piece because the resin will flow off the edge. You mix up that resin, you pour it on top, and that is a top coat. It will then make your pieces nice and shiny. This only works if you can do it on a level surface. Obviously, if you've got a round piece, top coating is a lot more trickier because resin self-levels, and if it's going to pour off the edges, you're not going to get an even amount of resin the whole way around. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below, because I know there is so much to cover when you are talking about casting resin, and I tried to answer as much as I could in this video, but there is a lot to go over. So if you've got questions, leave them down below. I'm always happy to answer them. And if you do want me to do another beginner's guide to casting, but this time focusing on doing deep pour castings, then let me know in the comments below and I can do a video on that as well and completely cover all of the basics for that. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. But thank you so much for watching.